Hey, welcome to the Dropship Podcast. Today, we're going to answer a question we got in our Dropship Tribe Facebook group. Does dropshipping work in a small country? And I think I have some clarifying questions of what is too small. But I'm the guy in the U.S., America. I don't know if I know any answers to this, John. Like, I've worked with some people in Australia, in the U.K., even some other European countries, I believe. But I don't know if I know the answer to this. Where would you begin?
Yeah, look, I think, the question of what's which is probably a fairly open-ended question, is like, what is a small country? What do you find as a small country? I think for some people, when they use that terminology, and we do get this question a bit, right? I mean, yes, a lot of people who listen to our show are in the US, of course. That's where most people who listen to this show are, just because it's population-wise such a large country and it has the largest e-commerce market in the world. So, I think so. It makes sense that most of our listeners are here, but we do have listeners around the world in a lot of other countries, and people want to know if it's going to work for them in those other countries. And so, for some people, I would say they would call Australia a small country, right? So that's where I started my first business. But there are countries that are, once again, the UK is between Australia and the US. It's still quite a bit smaller than the US, though, less than half the size population-wise. And so you might say that's a small country compared to the US. But then there are other countries, if you get into Europe, Scandinavia, we have students who live in Scandinavia, countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, which have even smaller populations, again, some of those than Australia. In New Zealand, we have listeners in New Zealand. We have students in Dropship Breakthru who live in New Zealand, which is, once again, a much smaller population even than Australia. And so I think those countries are definitely what you would class as smaller countries. There will be people listening to this episode who are sitting in one of those countries right now and probably asking the question, can I do it here? And so I think there's some different ways of looking at this. I mean, my answer most of the time is yes. It can work. I think but there's a couple of things to talk through. The first thing is your country must have an established e-commerce market, I think. So are people already buying stuff online in your country? Now, if you're you're listening to our podcast in a developing country, and hello if you are, thanks for listening to us. There are countries in the world that do not have an established e-commerce market, as in people do not regularly buy things online. And I think if you're in one of those spaces, you could take the view that, well, if I get in now and start building something, maybe one day that'll change and I'll be there. That's true to an extent, but that's a pretty long path to follow. And that might not be where you want to be at right now. So drop shipping in that scenario, maybe that's not going to work. But if you're in a country and you can say, yeah, I buy stuff online, people around me buy stuff online, so you've got to cross that first hurdle. Now, if the answer to that is yes, then I think in most cases it can work, but you might approach it a little bit differently, right? So, and what you might approach differently is how you define your market or your niche, if you use that terminology for it. And it tends to be in a smaller country, you tend to go broader. So this is true in Australia, like compared to the US. So everything we tend to compare back to the US. So in the US, you can be quite specific in terms of how you define your market and all that sort of thing. Like you could sell one type of product right in the US, and we've both done this before, and make a decent amount of money just selling one type of product. In a smaller country, you can't do that. You definitely can't do that, right? Because there just won't be enough volume for you to make any real, if you've got visions of growing a large business, it's just not going to be an opportunity for you there. So you probably want to sell a range of related products. You still want to try and serve a common interest and all that sort of thing, but you want to try and sell a wider range of products than you might sell in larger countries. The advantage I see in smaller countries most often, though, is one of competition. There tends to also be less competition, as well as a smaller market. Yes, it's a smaller market, but there also tends to be less competition and less sophisticated competition in my experience. And so for that reason, there may also be some really good opportunities in those smaller markets. And that was always the case. When I started in Australia, which I would define as a smaller country, it absolutely works here 100%. We've had lots of successful students. I've had success here. Almost nobody was doing this dropshipping stuff when I started. back in 2014. And so there was tons of opportunity. Suppliers you could talk to, they'd never done dropshipping before. You really had to explain it to them or walk them through it. But most were open to it once they understood what the goal was going to be and how it worked. So there's a lot of opportunity. You just come at it a little bit differently. And I think if you're talking about somewhere, if you're in Europe particularly, just remember you're part of the EU. So you can in a lot of cases, you can use suppliers in other countries. And you don't have the same challenges of shipping between countries that, say, I would in Australia. It's really hard for me to get supplies from outside of Australia and bring products in because you've got currency differences, you've got customs taxes, all of that sort of thing. If you're in Europe and you can deal with supplies in other EU countries, the only barrier you may have is language, but otherwise you don't have a lot of those things. You're a single currency. You don't have the same sort of customs requirements to move things between countries. And geographically, Europe is actually really small. A lot of people don't realize this. Europe geographically is much smaller than Australia. It's much smaller than North America. And so time for things to ship between countries there is actually very low. So if you're in Scandinavia, you could be getting products from a country with a much larger population like Germany, for example, and shipping them into your country and selling them to your customers there. And that actually would not be as difficult as it sounds. And certainly much less difficult for somebody like if you're in the US or if you're in Australia, bringing things in from other countries is much more difficult. And it tends to be something that we don't do. But I think if you're in Europe, and there are a lot of smaller countries in Europe, you do have some opportunities that don't exist in other parts of the world that you could work in very much to your advantage. I think you need to do a bit of research there and really look into that. But I would say often the exciting thing is in a lot of smaller countries, yes, you have a smaller market size, but I think you have a lot of opportunity in most cases because you could be the first one doing this sort of thing or one of the first ones doing this sort of thing. And that's I think that's really exciting.
Hey, obviously you're interested in high ticket dropshipping, wondering what you're going to sell. That's usually what people think about long before they ever purchase a course or even get started. John and I want to help you with that. We're running a 5-day challenge. Check it out at dropshipbreakthru.com/5. 5 days. You'll figure out exactly what you're going to sell and you'll be ready to start your high ticket dropshipping journey when you're done. It's going to come with its own challenges, right? Smaller countries are going to have different challenges than for the US. You got to do things at a slightly higher level in order to compete in the marketplace. There's just more people competing for the same eyes. And so a good example is one of our students, I helped him with some SEO in Australia, and he was doing decent SEO. In America, it would not have flied where he was doing it. But in Australia, he was doing quite well. In fact, he was ranking #1 for a lot of amazing terms. And so I gave him a couple tweaks to do. And if that boost him to #1 for a much more terms, great. But in America, you'd really have to nail in some things on SEO if you wanted any chance to rank it, specifically in that industry. What are some downsides, John? What are some extra hurdles people are going to have to go through in these smaller countries that they may not have to go through in America? I know, you're going to have firsthand experience here. In 2014, you had to educate your suppliers. That's one good example. Yeah. You might have to educate them on what this could look like. What else might you run into? Yeah,
but I think that's a challenge, but also an opportunity because by comparison, in the US, where every supplier has been asked about drop shipping and may have probably tried it at least if they're not doing it all the time, there's very firmly held views about it, right? And so people will either be okay with it or they'll be really against doing it, and they'll just say, no, we don't do that. We don't do that stuff, right? Whereas if you're in a place where it hasn't really happened a lot, then you can sort of shape people's opinion on it by giving them a good experience with you as a good drop shipper, right? And I think that's an opportunity as well as a challenge. Other challenges can sometimes be around shipping. So countries with less developed e-commerce markets, once again, comparing Australia to the US, there is more challenges around getting products shipped in Australia than there is in the US, right? Just because of the development of our logistics chains in Australia is I think personally much, and we have a much more dispersed population and all of this sort of thing, right? So there's extra challenges. It tends to be more expensive. Suppliers are less likely to provide the shipping for you. You more often than not have to arrange it yourself, which once again they are challenges that you can overcome. They're just more things you need to be aware of and you need to work on. And so that's definitely one. I don't think there's a lot. I think it just comes back because, like I say, some things are easier. Like, to get to the top of the search results is often a lot easier, for example, and taking advantage of some of the traffic platforms are much less competitive. And so you can get to the top a lot easier. And so I think the challenges mostly come around making sure that you define your market in a way that allows you to build a business that can grow to a point where you want to get to, right? I mean, if you've got aspirations of building a large business, like multiple 7 figures a year in revenue or 8 figures a year in revenue, if you really want to push it up there, there's going to be some realities around hitting those numbers in a smaller country if you are too specific about what you sell. Like, as in, it's definitely not going to be possible. So I think the way you set your business up in the beginning is going to be very important. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you can change that over time, but getting it right in the beginning, I think, is an important part of it. So, yeah, look, everything else though tends to work the same. People often ask me, is traffic generation different? Do you have to do different advertising in smaller countries that aren't the US or something like that? And the answer is actually no, not really. I mean, these days, Google Shopping is pretty much in every Western country, and in a lot of developing countries as well. So you can use Google Shopping. SEO, the Google search engine is available in pretty much every country in a country-specific way. So SEO will work for you. Email marketing works no matter what country you're in. If people have an email address, you can email them. Every country, outside of a couple in the world has most of the social media networks. So you can utilize those to connect with customers. So not really. All of those sort of things, the scale might be different, but you can do them pretty much in exactly the same way that you would do them in the US. I will say, because I got an email from somebody just the other day who was like, I'm thinking of buying your course. But there's this guy in my country who sells a course that he says is specific to this country. And the way he does dropshipping is just for this country. And so should I buy his course and not yours? And that's just marketing, right? There is no country-specific ways to do high-ticket dropshipping. The way we do it works with a few modifications, which we talk about in our program, in every country. So once again, if you're in a smaller country and you see people telling you need to do it in a specific way, they're not actually teaching you a different way. It's all the same.
Well, I would encourage, look, I learned a lot. I'm sure other people did. But if you still have questions, if you're like, well, what about my country? Hop into the Dropship Tribe Facebook group and just post in there and say, hey, I live in this country. I'm thinking about selling here. I think you'd be surprised how many students or just followers we have that are selling in a bunch of random countries. And you might find somebody in there who's paved the way for you, right? You don't need to be a pioneer here. They can be like, yeah, I've been doing it, in this country for a while and it works great. Or maybe they'll tell you there isn't enough e-commerce infrastructure built in the country and that it didn't work there. And so, maybe take some of the didn't work with a grain of salt, depending on what country it is, but you're probably going to find some answers in the Dropship Tribe. So come check us out, Dropship Tribe on Facebook.
And I think the other thing, just to close with, if you are in a country and you're listening and you're like, it's not going to work here, your fallback can always be, you can do business in the US, right? One great thing about America is that as somebody who lives in another country, you can actually start a company there. You're going to pay to get it set up, but you can do that. Whereas in a lot of other countries, as somebody who doesn't reside there or isn't a citizen there, it's actually very hard to do. And we have, once again, quite a few students who are doing very well running a business in the US from another country because, like we have students in India who live in India and are running a business in the US. We have people who live in Europe who are running a business in the US because, for whatever reason, they didn't think it was that they could do it in their country. And they're running a business, they're doing drop shipping and they're making money. So there is always that fallback for you if you do happen to live in a part of the world. If you're listening to our podcast and you're somewhere in Africa or something like that, you can still do drop shipping. You just may not do it in your country.